Welcome to the What to Read Next podcast. In this podcast, your host, Lori and me, will interview published authors to chat about their work, journey to getting published, and their book recommendations. If you share a passion for books and always looking for your next read, then join us. Hi, Tori. Welcome to What to Read Next podcast.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
So happy to have you here. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, gosh. Well, I live outside of Atlanta now, but I was a Midwestern girl by birth. I was born in Cincinnati, where my book takes place, and we moved when I was 10, and I lived in Indiana and Michigan and everything. And I've been married for 43 years to my love of my life, and we have 2 sons who are grown and gone and 2 grandchildren. And I also have a daytime job where I am a marketing executive at a national law firm that's based in Atlanta. And so writing is my passion and just something I've been doing for a while.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to dive into that. So what inspired you to become a writer?
You know, I think I first realized I enjoyed writing when I was in 7th grade in English class. We had an assignment, and I remember walking down the sidewalk and thinking about how I was going to phrase that and write it. And then by 9th grade, I had more of an interest. In high school, I kind of went the journalism route a little bit in those years. And then in college, I minored in English, and somewhere in my 20s, I knew I wanted to write a book someday, but I just didn't have much of a clue how to begin doing that. It took me a long time of study and practice. I actually became, I think I came to loving history before I even came to loving writing and reading. I remember when I was 5 years old, my grandparents took me to a museum in Detroit where they lived at the time for a short time. And I literally remember standing there in the museum looking at a Ford Model T, and I was hooked. By 5th grade, my dad asked me, where should we go on vacation? And I said, I want to go to, and this was in Indiana. I'm like this little girl from Indiana at that time. And I said, I want to go to Jamestown, Virginia. So I love the history. I love the writing, and that all kind of came into inspiring me to do a book.
I love this. And so what was your journey to get that first book published?
Well, I'm definitely a late bloomer. Let's see, 20 years ago or 21 years ago, when my younger son left for college, it was really at that time we became empty nesters, and I decided, well, if I'm ever going to try to write a book, I'm going to write one. And so I did. I've actually written 2 books that, as authors sometimes say, that are in the drawer. And then I wrote the 3rd one. I wrote Millicent, and that one got published. My first novel was a historical romance, and it was set in the late 1700s England. And then I wrote, and I didn't get an agent for that one. And then a few years later, I wrote, it took me, like 3 or 4 years for each book, because I just do it part-time in my free time. But then the 2nd book was a strictly historical, but it was also set in late 18th century England. And it was a dual timeline. It was actually set partly in the United States and partly in England, I guess I should say. And I got an agent for that, and got a lot of interest from publishers, but ultimately didn't get a book deal. So I started again, and I wrote Millicent, which is contemporary and then goes back to the 40s and 50s. It doesn't go as far back in history. But I think you'll probably want to talk about what inspired me to write that story specifically. But yeah, my writing journey has been 2 decades in my free time. And I took classes, and I went to conferences, and I've done a lot of study and a lot of reading to get here.
I love this. And so what was your writing process like? Do you find an outline, or did you see where the story leads you?
I'm an outliner. I do write a sort of a rough outline. I certainly know how it's going to end,
Mm-hmm.
And then through the writing process, as I get to know the characters and the place and the story more, and through the act of revision, things sometimes change. There might be detours, or I might discover new things or add a little subplot or something. But generally, I'm a planner in my life, and I'm a planner with the story.
And so how do you develop the characters? Do they come to you? Do you brainstorm? What's the process like to develop the characters?
Gosh, I know some authors who they'll just say, I had this character in my mind. It hasn't come to me that way. For me, I come to the story first, I think, and the place. And then I decide, what character has to be. Like in Millicent, Glenn's Last Wish, I knew I had to develop Millie, but also I wanted her to have a granddaughter. And so I just go with that. And then I start developing them based on how old they are and what their history would have been. Like with Millicent's character, even though she was in the 40s and 50s in my book, I knew that she was born in the 20s. And that led me to create her family, because it was based in Cincinnati, and the research I'd done led me to create her coming from an impoverished family that had suffered from prohibition with, this German brewery industry so heavy in that city at that time, which was new to me in my research. And so, the setting and the time period and the story will help me develop the characters.
I love this. And so let's talk about Millicent's Glenn's Last Wish. What was the source of inspiration? You touch a little bit upon it, but I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, well, that the story opens when she's almost 91 years old in the contemporary narrative, because it's a dual timeline story and it goes back and forth. And one of the sources, there's a number of sources, but years ago in my career, I worked for a retirement community where the average age of the resident was in their 90s. And what I found in those years working there, even though I was in a public relations type role, I enjoyed the residents and spent a lot of time with them. And they would open up about these secrets they had from their past. They would, I loved hearing their historical stories. But then the next thing I know, they're telling me about this big lie that they told, that they were always afraid that it would get out, or something maybe that someone had done to them that was mean and hurt them really badly, and they carried this all their life. And so part of me thinks that sometimes, people have secrets that they keep all their lives, and ultimately sometimes they need to let that out. But also on the other end, there was this experience I had when I was a child. I think I was about 5 years old, and my family was at this big family reunion. And I remember it was in this park, it was a picnic, and I'd gone up to this little stone water drinking fountain. And there were some older and distant cousins who I didn't really know, and I couldn't even tell you who they are, but I overheard them say something that had happened to one of the relatives in the family, a woman. And the image is a spoiler, so I won't talk about it. It actually, that image stayed in my mind all my life until I started writing this book, which was, at the time I was in my late 50s when I started writing this. And it's stuck, and it became the seed for a pivotal scene in the book. Yeah, in the maternity ward.
Ooh, okay. I know what you're talking about. So you wrote Jewel's timeline. So how do you juggle writing 2015, 1940s, 1950s? Did you write them at once, or did you write one timeline first and then the second timeline? What was the process like?
That's a really good question because authors will do it different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to some who they write straight through the
Mm-hmm.
historical modern, all the way through the way the story is in the book. Then I know others that they write the whole modern thread and then they go back and they write the whole historical thread and weave them together. I'm kind of a hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
I write, like, say, a few chapters in the modern and then a few chapters in the historical, and then weave those together. Then I go the next few. So in my head, I can kind of stay in one time period for a few chapters, and then something will spur me to go into the other period, and I stay in there for a few chapters and go back and forth that way. It's really hard, I think, to do no matter how you do it, because say in the second or third or even 10th draft, if something changes in one time period, it can very well throw off the whole book. You have to go back to the modern period because ultimately you have these little cliffhangers and various things that have to be woven in timing, like if something bad happens in the historical part and you're trying to have something bad happen in the modern part too, the timing, the pacing, and the fit and the weaving is, the structure can be hard. And if you make a change, then you better expect it's going to affect 2, 3, or 4 more chapters, and maybe even have to make changes all through, little changes in other chapters too.
I'm always fascinated because it's like writing one timeline, it's hard, but writing 2 timelines is like extra hard, because you have to get through like trying to figure out how to make sense of it and how to pace it and how to get the twists and turns that will keep you engaged throughout the whole book. So I can
You're absolutely right. and you're effectively writing 2 stories.
Yeah.
And then there's the weaving, but it's 2 completely, each story has its own arc. Mm-hmm. And then the book as a whole has an arc too. So yeah, I've read hundreds of dual timeline books. I love them so much. And for me, it's that fix of the historical fiction as well as the modern family drama. And so I get a bit of both. And I don't know, I really had to work at learning how to write that structure.
Well, thank you for doing it. So let's talk about Millie. Millie is an older heroine. She's 91 when we meet her in 2015, and she's a bit younger in 1945. What was the process like developing her, her storyline, and then seeing the family tree and all the different parts,
Yes. Well, I knew that she was going to be married. That was going to be a critical part. And it was a big decision. At what point do I start her life in the historical narrative? And I started it actually with her wedding. The book opens with the prologue that's in modern day. And then it goes right to part 1 in 1944. Where she's getting married. And there was a reviewer that recently said that the book was like a coming of age story in reverse. And I really love that. It was like she's old, but then she discovers herself from everything that happened in the past. And also, I just love that you are a great reader of romance novels. And I also think that the story is a little bit, you could say, a romance in reverse too, because she starts out getting married, but the story really is of all kinds of things. It's a mother, daughter, granddaughter, 3 generations of women's story. But I think it's also a love story. And even though they get married at the beginning, I mean, it's really about the love story angle is about, or for better or for worse, the marriage vows. And after Millie and her husband Dennis go through so much, including tragedy, and so much in their relationship, will they survive and will their marriage last? And for me, the love story was part of it too. So, I'm sorry. What was your question?
You're fine. I think you gave us a glimpse of Molly and her life. And so for listeners who have not read the book, they can pick it up and they can get the little taste of what to expect, which is a coming of age in reverse. I like that idea. I think that's a good description of this book,
Good. Love that. Another kind of going back to your inspiration question too, and tying it in with this one. It really is also about Millie and her daughter, who is in her 60s, and she's an ex-hippie, and they haven't gotten along all that well. And then there's the granddaughter who's in her 30s, and she's pregnant, and she's married, and she's having her first baby. And I found that I love books about multiple generations, and it seemed to me that piece of it sort of came naturally. Although I struggled with Jane, I struggled writing her as a character more, but generally I love multiple generations. And when I was born as a baby, I was the 5th living generation in my family. And then decades later, when my grandchildren came along, my family had 5 generations again, and that's pretty rare. So I'm kind of all about generational stuff, and it just is sort of in my DNA, I guess.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
I didn't even realize until I was done with the book. I actually already had it submitted to the editor in its final version that I was submitting to them. When I sat back, Laura, and I realized it wasn't just about 3 generations. The book actually has 5 generations in it, because you've got Millie, and then you've got her mother, and then you got her mother, Millie, Jane, Kelsey, and Kelsey's baby who's coming. And so there's 5 generations affected. They're not all alive at once, but like my family, it was. But it's very much a generational story too.
I love this. So, what are some of your upcoming projects? What are you currently working on?
I actually just got a new book deal a few weeks ago. Yeah, for my 2nd published book. And this one is a little different in that I'm contracted to write it. I had to write part of the book and a whole synopsis, outline, and everything to get the deal. But as opposed to Millicent, which the book was completely written, and then got the book deal, and it got edited and revised with the editors and stuff. But this one I'm still writing. And it also is a dual timeline. And yet it takes place not in Cincinnati. It takes place in Kentucky. And in the modern storyline, she's in her 20s, main character works for a bourbon distillery. Kentucky is filled with bourbon distilleries. It's like, I guess if you think of Napa Valley being where Americans' wine industry is, or if you think of Scotland, where Scotch comes from, Kentucky's really the hub of the bourbon industry. And she works there. And then her great aunt, who is deceased, also was born and raised in Kentucky. But in the 1920s, the historical main character named Violet leaves Kentucky and goes to Detroit. And it's during Prohibition. It's during the automotive boom with Henry Ford and that whole Model T thing, as I was sort of indicating earlier. And it's going to be fun. I think the character in the historical part is going to have fun. Ultimately, she leaves a journal for her great niece, though. And we learned that it wasn't always fun. And then the main character in the modern day also learns that her great great aunt was not quite as prim and proper as she always thought she was.
Gosh,
So
it's so exciting.
there's a lot more involved, but that's kind of part of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that sounds so good. So now let's go to a round of book recommendations. It's an opportunity to share with our audience what they should read next. What is your favorite genre?
Well, if I had to pick one, it would be historical. But as I was kind of suggesting earlier, I love dual timeline books, and it gives me contemporary and historical all in one fix. So if we could call dual timelines a genre, then it would probably be that.
Yeah.
I read other things too. I read the occasional thriller and all modern books, not necessarily any historical component at all. And so
I love this. And so what has been a book you read this past year or last year or at some point that you loved?
Oh, wow. My favorite book that I've read this year, and the year's almost over, it was Code Name Helene by Ariel Lawhon. And it's historical. It's all historical. It actually doesn't have any modern timeline in it at all. It kind of goes back and forth between two periods, but they're only like 10 years apart or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, it's like maybe going back and forth between the 30s and the 40s or something. But gosh, it was just so well written. And the main character, it's mainly based in World War II. She's just such a kick butt woman. And I love all of Ariel Lawhon's books. And I mean, her settings and her dialogue of her characters and just everything. This one was really tense. I mean, this woman was a spy, and she was based on a real life person, by the way. So, yeah, that's probably my favorite book of the year.
Oh my gosh, I have to check it out. So, so tell us where you can find you online.
I am mainly on Instagram, but I do have an author webpage too, author Facebook page, and I'm on Twitter, and I've been on there a while, but I think I am probably on Instagram most. And so that handle, or whatever you call it, is Tori, Tori .Whitaker, WHITAKER .37. Why I came up with that, I have no idea, but it's Tori.Whitaker 37. I like engaging with readers and bloggers and podcasters and other authors and everything.
I love this. Thank you, Tori, for being on the show.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to share with friends, subscribe, rate, and review the show. This is the easiest way to support this podcast. Once you connect with fellow romance readers and make new friends, get weekly book recommendations, attend monthly meetups, then join our Patreon community. You can join at whattoreadnextblog.com/Patreon. Romance lovers, check out Queen Bee Reads Etsy shop for cute and comfortable bookish apparel. The shop also features social justice apparel and fun items from some of your favorite TV shows like The Schitt's Creek and The Office. Use code WhatToRead10 to save. Visit whattoreadnextblog.com/QueenBeeReads. What to Read Next podcast is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Discover new podcasts to love on frolic.media/podcast. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.